Have you ever walked into a room only to be met with disbelief and judgment simply because you didn't fit someone's idea of who should belong? If this story made you rethink assumptions and judgments, share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear how you would handle such a moment. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more powerful stories. The sun had barely begun to peek over the horizon as Angela Harper stepped onto the private airfield in Santa Monica. The smell of jet fuel mixed with the fresh, salty air of the ocean, and Angela wrapped her lightweight scarf a little tighter around her neck, the cool morning breeze brushing against her skin. Her heels clicked on the smooth tarmac as she walked toward the sleek Gulfstream G700 parked in the distance. She owned this plane. Well, it wasn't just a plane. It was her pride and joy, the manifestation of years of hard work and sacrifice. But as she walked toward it, no one around her would know that. Angela was in her early 40s, dressed in a simple but elegant navy blue suit with her blonde hair tied neatly back. She looked every bit the part of a businesswoman, polished, calm, composed. But today, she wasn't just any executive. Today, she was the owner of this jet, one of the finest in the world. She had earned every inch of this success. The cabin was empty, just as she had expected. The soft hum of the engines the only sound filling the air. She placed her carry-on near the second row on the right side, the seat she always preferred for its proximity to the window. The flight was supposed to be routine, a quick trip to Dallas for a board meeting and then back to Los Angeles by evening. She had done it hundreds of times. Angela glanced at her watch. She was early as usual. She always arrived early. It gave her time to breathe before the world rushed in, time to gather her thoughts before the next whirlwind of meetings and decisions. But that calm didn't last long. Just as she sat down and slipped off her scarf, the sound of high heels clicking against the polished floor interrupted her thoughts. She turned to see a flight attendant, mid-30s with platinum blonde hair pulled into a tight bun, marching toward her. The woman's gaze was suspicious, sharp, and her posture was stiff, like a soldier about to confront an intruder. "Excuse me, who are you and what are you doing here?" The words were abrupt, not the welcoming greeting Angela was accustomed to, and they hit her like a cold splash of water. Angela stood up slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled. She could feel the tension building in the air, but her voice remained steady as she answered. "I'm supposed to be here," she said with a calm, polite smile. But the flight attendant didn't soften. Instead, she crossed her arms and stepped closer, her face hardening with suspicion. "And who exactly said you could board this aircraft?" The question, pointed and demanding, seemed to echo in the spacious cabin. Angela blinked in disbelief. Was this really happening? "I own the plane," she said, her voice steady. The flight attendant let out a sharp, almost dismissive laugh. "Yeah, sure you do," she said, her tone mocking, as if Angela had just made an outlandish claim. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to leave right now." The words stung, but Angela didn't flinch. She had been through too much to let something like this unsettle her. This was her plane, her company, and she wasn't about to let a random flight attendant undermine that. But as the confrontation continued, Angela's mind raced. How could anyone be so blind to the truth? How could they judge her so quickly based on appearances alone? But it didn't matter. She wasn't here to fight or raise her voice. She simply needed the attendant to understand one thing. This was her jet, and no one had the right to treat her this way. Angela took a step forward, her eyes meeting the attendant's. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. The flight attendant, whose name was Melinda, stood a few feet away, arms still crossed tightly over her chest, her face a mixture of disbelief and condescension. She didn't seem to believe a word Angela had said. The look in her eyes told a story of doubt. She simply couldn't reconcile the woman standing before her with the image of someone who could possibly own a private jet like this. Angela could see it in the way Melinda's gaze flickered over her outfit, sleek but modest, and the way her eyes narrowed, as if searching for any sign of wealth or power that might align with the truth Angela had just stated. In Melinda's mind, the woman in front of her didn't fit the usual mold of a wealthy business person. Angela was dressed simply, without any flashy jewelry or expensive accessories. Her blonde hair was tied back in a functional, neat ponytail, not styled in the extravagant way that one might expect of someone wealthy enough to own a jet. Melinda, perhaps unwittingly, had already painted Angela into a box where only certain types of people could belong, and Angela didn't fit the stereotype. Angela's thoughts flickered to the countless times she had been underestimated in her career. Times when her age, appearance, or demeanor led people to make assumptions about her capabilities, her success, and her worth. But she had learned long ago not to let that bother her. She had spent years proving herself, building her business, and cultivating the kind of quiet power that came with true success. Yet here she was, standing in her own jet, her own domain, being treated as though she were some sort of imposter. Melinda's voice broke through her thoughts, sharp and filled with authority, though Angela could tell it was starting to crack under the pressure of her own disbelief. "I'm going to need you to leave right now," she repeated, her voice tinged with impatience, as though she were somehow in charge of the situation, as though she had the right to make demands in this space. Angela could feel the first stirrings of frustration bubbling up within her, but she swallowed it down. There was no point in losing her cool now. She was not going to let this woman see her rattle. Instead, Angela took a slow, deliberate breath and remained calm. "I am the owner of this jet, and I am supposed to be here. I don't know what's going on, but I'm not leaving," she said firmly, meeting Melinda's glare with her own unwavering gaze. There was a pause. The silence seemed to stretch on forever as Melinda processed the words. Angela could see the internal battle happening behind the attendant's eyes. She wanted to dismiss her, to throw her out, to prove herself right, but something in her expression started to falter. For the first time, Melinda's posture softened just slightly, the rigidity easing out of her stance, though she didn't back down. "I don't care who you say you are," Melinda finally snapped, her tone becoming sharp again. "I know who's supposed to be on this plane, and it's not you. You need to leave." Angela's jaw tightened. She could feel the heat of anger rising in her chest, but she knew better than to let it show. She had worked too hard to let a petty confrontation ruin her day, or worse, let it escalate further. But there was something deeper at play here. It wasn't just about her. It was about the way people like Melinda made assumptions based on appearance, class, and status. It was about the deep-seated prejudices that still ran rampant in the world, the way people judged each other before ever getting to know them. Angela was the CEO of Covington Aviation Group, a successful entrepreneur who had built an empire from the ground up. But to Melinda, she wasn't someone who belonged in a place like this, not because of what Angela had accomplished, but because of how she looked and who she was. Young, female, and dressed simply, without the trappings of old money or high society. The world had a way of overlooking people like Angela, of making them feel invisible, like they didn't deserve their place in the world. But Angela had no intention of backing down. "I'm not leaving," she repeated, her voice steady, but with an underlying steel that made it clear she wasn't going anywhere. "This is my plane, my company. You're not going to tell me otherwise." Melinda looked at her for a long moment, eyes flicking over her again, the disbelief still present but starting to be replaced by uncertainty. It was almost as if Melinda was trying to convince herself that Angela didn't belong here, that she couldn't possibly be the person she said she was. But the longer she looked at Angela, the more she seemed to realize that this was no ordinary woman in front of her firm. Angela wasn't someone who could be dismissed or overlooked so easily. "Get the captain," Angela said quietly, her voice unwavering, despite the tension still hanging in the air. It was a small request, but Angela knew it was the only way to break the impasse. And as Melinda hesitated, Angela stood taller, the power of her presence growing in the silence between them. The confrontation was far from over, but Angela was determined to see it through. She wasn't going to back down. Not now, not ever. The tension in the cabin grew as the seconds stretched out, and for a moment everything seemed to stand still. Angela stood firm, not letting her gaze falter or her resolve waver. The flight attendant, Melinda, was clearly rattled now. Her posture was stiff, her arms crossed tighter across her chest as she stared at Angela, trying to maintain an air of authority that was crumbling with each passing moment. Angela could see the moment the realization dawned on her. Melinda had been expecting an easy confrontation, someone she could dismiss and control, but Angela was no ordinary passenger. She had lived her entire life defying the expectations of others, proving time and time again that she wouldn't be judged by her appearance or assumptions about who she should be. In that moment, Angela's presence alone seemed to shake Melinda's certainty. Melinda took a deep breath, but there was no mistaking the crack in her voice as she asked, Do you honestly expect me to believe you own this plane? You don't look like someone who would own something like this. Angela could see the prejudice in her words, the assumption that someone of her age and appearance couldn't possibly belong in such a place. She didn't even try to hide her disbelief at Angela's claim. Angela's heart quickened, but her exterior remained calm. She had seen this before. People who were quick to judge based on outward appearances, assuming that a woman like her didn't fit the mold of a successful business owner. But this time was different. This wasn't just about her. This was about showing Melinda and anyone else who might harbor such assumptions that respect wasn't something anyone had the right to withhold. I own this plane, Melinda, Angela said, her voice cold and firm, cutting through the tension like a sharp knife. I own this company, Covington Aviation. I built this business from the ground up, and I'm telling you, I'm not leaving. The words echoed through the cabin, and for the first time, Angela saw the flight attendant's eyes flicker with doubt. She stepped back slightly, her arms uncrossing, but there was still a look of disbelief in her expression. Melinda seemed to be processing the weight of Angela's words, trying to reconcile the woman standing before her with the image of a business tycoon she had always imagined in her mind. You really own it? Melinda stammered, the skepticism still thick in her voice. Angela nodded slowly, maintaining eye contact. Yes, I'm the CEO and founder of Covington Aviation Group. I built this company, and I've earned the right to be here. Melinda's face flushed a deep shade of red, and for a brief moment, Angela wondered if the attendant would break down in embarrassment. But Melinda wasn't ready to admit her mistake just yet. She opened her mouth to speak, likely to accuse Angela of lying again, but Angela cut her off. You're not listening, Melinda, Angela said firmly. You're judging me by how I look, not by what I've accomplished. I've worked for this, and you have no right to treat me like an intruder on my own jet. Melinda's jaw tightened, and her lips pressed into a thin line, as if she was weighing her next move. But before she could say another word, Angela made a small, deliberate gesture, reaching into her blazer and pulling out a crisp black and gold business card. She placed it on the tray table in front of Melinda with a quiet, controlled motion. This is my card, Angela said quietly. I'm the reason this plane exists, and I'm not going anywhere until I say so. Melinda hesitated, her eyes locked onto the business card, her fingers twitching as if unsure whether she should pick it up or not. The silence stretched on, thick with tension, but Angela didn't budge. She wouldn't allow herself to be intimidated by someone who couldn't see past their own narrow view of the world. Finally, Melinda's hand reached for the card, but she didn't say anything. She simply stared at it, eyes wide with a sudden realization that she had completely misjudged the situation. Angela could feel the power shift in the room, the passengers who had been watching from the sidelines now slowly beginning to stir, their eyes darting between Melinda and her. She didn't need to make a scene. She wasn't here to humiliate anyone, but she wasn't going to let anyone take advantage of her either. I'm calling security, Melinda finally stammered, but even her voice was uncertain now, cracking under the weight of what she had done. You're trespassing. Angela's gaze remained steady, unwavering. Please do, she said softly. Call them. And with that simple statement, Angela's confidence grew. She wasn't here to play into Melinda's prejudices. She wasn't going to let this woman, this flight attendant, who thought she could dictate who belonged in this space, get away with her assumptions. Angela had built her empire on the foundation of quiet power, the kind that didn't need to shout to be heard. But today, she wasn't going to back down. Today, she would show Melinda the true meaning of respect. The tension in the cabin was now unbearable, and Angela could feel the heat rising in her chest. She stood there, her hand still lingering near her cheek where Melinda's slap had landed, though she didn't touch it again. She refused to give the flight attendant the satisfaction of seeing her reaction. The sound of the slap had echoed through the quiet cabin, sharp and brutal, and for a brief moment, everything seemed to stop. The passengers who had been quietly settling into their seats froze, eyes wide, some gasping audibly at the sight of a flight attendant slapping a woman in a suit who appeared calm and composed. It was as if time had slowed down, and the only thing that existed was the strange, surreal scene unfolding in front of them. Angela didn't flinch, didn't raise her voice, and didn't show a single sign of weakness. She simply stood there, her expression as cold as the steel walls of the jet, locking eyes with Melinda. It was in that silence, that tense moment, that Melinda seemed to realize the magnitude of her mistake. The slap, as rash and impulsive as it had been, had crossed a line that was impossible to uncross. Angela's unwavering calm in the face of such aggression sent a message far stronger than any words ever could. Passengers began to stir, slowly pulling their phones out of their bags, some whispering to each other, others staring openly, captivated by the confrontation. A man near the front, his face filled with disgust, dropped his coffee cup. It hit the carpet with a soft thud, the steaming liquid spilling onto the fibers, unnoticed. A woman gasped and pulled her child behind her, almost as if trying to shield the young one from what was happening in front of them. The cabin was now filled with the hum of low conversations and mutters of disbelief. People exchanged glances, unsure of how to respond, but the silent judgment was evident. They were watching, waiting, trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. Angela's heart was still racing, but she knew this wasn't about her. It was about something far bigger. This moment, as uncomfortable as it was about showing everyone what it meant to stand up for yourself and your worth, no matter who you were or how you looked. With deliberate movements, Angela slowly bent down, picked up her blazer from the seat, and brushed an invisible piece of lint off the sleeve. She was the picture of calm, exuding an air of control and grace, as if nothing had happened at all. But underneath, she was seething. Not at Melinda. Melinda was just a symptom of the problem, but at the way people assumed they could judge her based on her appearance alone. The fact that someone like Melinda thought she could treat her this way spoke volumes about the biases that still existed in the world. Angela had spent her entire life fighting against those assumptions. She had worked tirelessly to build her company, Covington Aviation Group, from the ground up. She had earned every bit of the success she now had. But here she was, on her own plane, being treated like an outsider. Melinda, meanwhile, seemed to be grasping at straws. She was shaking, her fingers fumbling as she pulled out a small radio from her waistband. "I'm calling security," she said again, but her voice lacked the conviction it had moments ago. Angela looked at her, calm as ever, and simply said, "Please do call them." The words were quiet, but they carried the weight of the situation. It was like a challenge. Angela wasn't afraid. She wasn't intimidated by this woman or by the situation at hand. She knew who she was, and she wasn't about to let anyone treat her as though she didn't belong. The passengers, still watching intently, exchanged nervous glances. Some looked toward the door, unsure if they should stay or leave, but no one moved. No one spoke up, but the silence was thick with anticipation. They were waiting to see how this would play out, unsure of who would win this strange, silent battle. Angela had nothing to prove, but in that moment she knew she had to stand her ground. This wasn't just about her. It was about showing everyone in that cabin that assumptions and judgments didn't define who she was. Angela wasn't here to fight, but she wasn't going to let someone like Melinda get away with treating her with such disrespect. Her eyes remained locked on Melinda, unblinking, as she calmly waited for the next step in this absurd confrontation. And then, from the front of the plane, came a voice that broke through the tension. Captain Roland Gates, tall with silver streaks in his hair, stepped out of the cockpit, his frown deep and his eyes scanning the room. He recognized Angela immediately, and his expression shifted from concern to alarm as he approached. "Miss Harper," he said, his voice loud enough to command attention. "Is everything all right?" The words hit Melinda like a slap. She turned toward the captain, her face a picture of confusion and disbelief. "Miss Harper?" she repeated, as if the name didn't register. Angela didn't respond to Melinda. Instead, she nodded toward Captain Gates. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding," Angela said, her voice smooth and controlled. She wasn't angry, but she wasn't going to let the situation slide. Captain Gates immediately shifted his attention to Melinda, his tone sharp but respectful. "I'm very sorry, ma'am," he said, casting a stern glance toward Melinda. "We'll handle this immediately." For the first time, Melinda's face drained of color, and she seemed to shrink under the weight of her actions. She looked around frantically, but there was no escape. Angela's quiet strength had already won the day. As the tension in the cabin started to dissipate, the once assertive flight attendant, Melinda, stood frozen, her face pale, as if she were slowly processing the enormity of her mistake. Angela, standing tall and composed, felt a sense of calm settle over her. The atmosphere in the plane had shifted. What had started as an uncomfortable confrontation had now become a public reckoning, with Melinda realizing that her actions had consequences far greater than she could have imagined. The captain, Captain Roland Gates, stood beside her now, his body language firm yet respectful. A man who knew his role and his place, and who recognized Angela for who she was. Captain Gates's deep voice broke the silence again, this time with authority, as he addressed Melinda. Melinda, you've made a serious error in judgment. I suggest you apologize to Miss Harper immediately. His words were sharp, but there was an underlying professionalism in his tone that was impossible to ignore. Angela, still calm, looked directly at Melinda, not with anger, but with the kind of quiet strength that demanded accountability. She wasn't here to destroy someone's life, but she wasn't going to let someone with such profound disrespect go unchallenged either. The passengers, who had been silently watching the unfolding drama, were now shifting in their seats, some whispering among themselves, others watching intently, waiting for the next move. Melinda's eyes darted nervously from Captain Gates to Angela and back again. It was as if she were waiting for some kind of escape, for a way out of this situation. But there was no turning back now. Angela had already set the tone, and Melinda's inability to handle it had exposed her weaknesses. Angela wasn't angry, but she was firm. Her voice, when she spoke again, was calm, but left no room for misinterpretation. I don't just own this plane, Melinda, she said, her words clear and deliberate. I own Covington Aviation Group. This jet, this flight, and everyone on it, every employee, every passenger, it's all part of the company I built. I'm the one who made this possible. You don't get to treat me like an intruder. The words hung in the air, and for the first time, Melinda seemed to shrink in on herself. She'd been so sure of herself earlier, her certainty that someone like Angela didn't belong here. But now, in front of the passengers, in front of the captain, and with the undeniable force of Angela's presence, she realized just how wrong she had been. The realization hit her like a freight train. For a long moment, she stood there, her mouth moving but no words coming out. The radio she had been clutching hung limply from her hand, the device now a silent witness to the consequences of her actions. It wasn't just Angela she had wronged. It was the passengers who had seen it, the people who had witnessed the power struggle between someone who knew their worth and someone who had assumed they were entitled to dismiss it. Angela wasn't here to ruin anyone's life. She wasn't looking for drama or chaos, but she was here to make a point that wasn't just about her, but about how people, especially women and those who don't fit a traditional mold, are often judged too quickly. I'm sorry, Melinda finally stammered, her voice weak, the apology coming out like an afterthought, devoid of real sincerity. Angela didn't react immediately. She didn't need to hear the apology to feel validated. The damage had been done, and this weak attempt at redemption only highlighted Melinda's lack of understanding about the gravity of her actions. Angela's gaze never wavered, her face unreadable as she processed the situation. She didn't want a forced apology. She wanted Melinda to understand why what she had done was unacceptable, not just for Angela, but for anyone who had ever been underestimated or dismissed. I'm not interested in a rehearsed line, Angela said quietly. What I need from you, Melinda, is an apology that comes from understanding. Understanding that you didn't just disrespect me. You disrespected everyone who's ever been judged by their appearance, their age, their gender. You didn't see me for who I am, and that's what needs to change. The silence stretched between them, and Melinda stood there, her shoulders slumped as she absorbed the weight of Angela's words. It wasn't about pride or power. It was about teaching a lesson, making someone see the world from a different perspective. Angela didn't need to publicly humiliate Melinda. That wasn't her style. Instead, she reached into the inner pocket of her blue blazer and pulled out a sleek, minimalistic business card. She placed it carefully on the tray table between them, letting it rest there like a challenge, an unspoken declaration of who she was and the power she commanded. It was a black card with gold foil trim, simple but powerful, just like Angela herself. The name on the card was unmistakable. Angela Harper, CEO and founder, Covington Aviation Group. Melinda stared at the card, her mouth slightly open, her hands trembling as she took it into her hands. still unable to comprehend the full scope of her mistake. She didn't say anything more. She couldn't. Angela remained composed, her eyes locked on Melinda as she waited for the inevitable. Finally, Captain Gates, who had been watching the exchange with a calm but firm demeanor, stepped closer. His voice when he spoke was measured and direct. "You need to apologize. And it needs to be sincere." There was no room for negotiation. There was no way out for Melinda. Slowly, Melinda's shoulders sagged even further. She was defeated, not by Angela, but by her own arrogance and inability to see the person in front of her for who she truly was. The apology came out weakly, but it was enough. For the first time, it seemed genuine, and Angela gave a small nod, acknowledging the moment. She wasn't here to destroy Melinda, but she wanted her to learn something valuable. The passengers were still watching, some whispering quietly to each other, others now visibly relieved that the tension was finally starting to ease. Melinda stepped back, her movement stiff, trying to regain some semblance of composure. But the lesson had already been learned, and Angela's quiet strength had won the day. As the tension in this cabin slowly began to dissolve, Angela remained calm, her face betraying no emotion as she observed Melinda's growing discomfort. It was as if the weight of her actions had finally settled into her consciousness, and she was struggling to come to terms with the gravity of what had just transpired. Melinda, still gripping the radio in her trembling hand, seemed lost in the realization of the mistake she had made. Her earlier confidence, that sharpness in her voice, was now nowhere to be found. It was replaced by an awkward silence that seemed to fill the entire cabin. The passengers, who had been quietly watching the exchange, had fallen into an uncomfortable stillness. Their eyes darted between Angela and Melinda, some of them shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The room, once filled with the hum of conversations, was now tense and expectant. Even the sound of the engines outside seemed muffled, as though the world itself had momentarily paused to witness the aftermath of this confrontation. Angela knew this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about something larger. The way people often make snap judgments based on superficial traits and the preconceived notions they carry with them. Melinda had assumed she could dismiss Angela because she didn't fit the image of someone who belonged in the world of private jets and high-stakes business. But Angela had spent her entire career defying those assumptions, proving time and time again that success wasn't determined by what someone looked like or the clothes they wore. It was about the work you put in, the integrity you carried, and the strength to stand firm in the face of adversity. As Angela sat quietly, letting the silence stretch, she noticed a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The passengers, who had been silently observing, seemed to understand the lesson unfolding before them. There was a palpable sense of respect that had begun to permeate the cabin, not for Angela's wealth, but for her composure, for the way she had handled herself in the face of unwarranted aggression. The power of the moment wasn't in the words spoken. It was in the way Angela had refused to be rattled. She had remained calm, unwavering, showing everyone in that cabin what it meant to stand up for yourself without raising your voice or resorting to theatrics. But this wasn't over yet. Angela wasn't interested in destroying Melinda or humiliating her in front of the passengers. She was here to make a point, to show that respect was something that should be freely given, not something that needed to be earned through preconceived notions or social expectations. When Melinda finally managed to speak again, her voice was shaky. "I'm calling security," she muttered, the words coming out like an attempt at reclaiming some authority in a situation that had completely spiraled out of her control. Angela didn't respond immediately. She simply nodded, letting Melinda make the call. In that moment, Angela didn't need to say anything more. Her presence, her quiet strength, had already spoken volumes. As Melinda turned to leave, Angela continued to sit, her gaze steady. She wasn't concerned about the threat of security. She knew that this moment, this exchange, had already been seen by the passengers around her, and it had already made its mark. Angela wasn't fighting for her own reputation anymore. She was fighting for a larger principle, the principle that respect should be unconditional, not based on appearances or assumptions. She wanted Melinda to understand that it wasn't her wealth or power that made her who she was. It was the way she carried herself, the strength she had built over years of hard work, and the unwillingness to let anyone define her worth for her. As Melinda hesitated by the cockpit, seemingly unsure whether to go through with her threat or back down, Angela remained seated, unfazed. Her eyes didn't leave Melinda's for a second, And it was in that look that the power shifted once more. Angela wasn't afraid. She wasn't going to be intimidated. And she wasn't going to let this woman, who clearly underestimated her, walk away thinking that she had gotten away with it. Melinda's hesitation spoke volumes. For a moment, Angela saw the fear in her eyes, and it was in that moment that she realized just how much of a difference she had made. She had shown Melinda and everyone else in that cabin that respect had to be earned. But it could not be demanded through aggression or force. It had to come from within, from understanding the inherent value of another person. When Captain Gates finally entered the scene, his authoritative presence seemed to add weight to the air, further cementing the truth of Angela's position. He recognized her immediately, and his eyes softened as he saw the tension in the cabin. He stepped forward with respect, addressing Angela with the formality that Melinda had failed to provide. He acknowledged the mistake, not just as an error in protocol, but as an offense that had to be corrected. "We'll handle this immediately," Captain Gates assured Angela, offering a respectful nod before turning his attention to Melinda. Angela remained calm, but inside, she felt a wave of satisfaction. She had made her point. Melinda was going to have to face the consequences of her actions. But Angela was above all of that. She had handled herself with grace, dignity, and the unwavering confidence that she had earned her place, no matter who doubted her. It was in this moment of quiet strength that Angela realized the true power of standing up for yourself, not through confrontation, but through steadfast resolve. As the flight continued its course, the tension that had gripped the cabin began to settle, but the weight of the moment still lingered in the air, thick and palpable. Angela sat back in her seat, her back straight, her hands resting gently in her lap. She stared out of the window, watching the landscape below, but her mind was far from the view. It was still processing what had happened, the slap, the confrontation, the misunderstanding that had escalated so quickly. She wasn't just angry at Melinda, though. No, Angela had long since learned that anger didn't get you anywhere. What stung was the assumption, the immediate judgment passed on her by someone who didn't know her, who didn't care to understand who she truly was. Melinda had seen a woman who didn't fit the profile of someone who owned a jet and ran a multi-million-dollar company. And in that moment, she had tried to use her position to dismiss Angela, to belittle her. What hurt the most was not the slap itself, but the realization that this kind of prejudice still existed. Even in this day and age, people like Angela were still judged based on their appearance, their gender, their age, and how others perceived them. Angela had spent her entire career breaking down barriers, proving herself in a world where women like her were often overlooked or underestimated. But today, this incident had shown her how much further that work still had to go. Angela's thoughts were interrupted as the plane began its descent into Dallas. She leaned back in her seat, taking a deep breath as the engines hummed a steady rhythm beneath her. The flight attendants, now noticeably quieter and more respectful, moved about the cabin, preparing for landing. But Angela couldn't help but notice the subtle shift in their behavior. They no longer treated her like an ordinary passenger. They were cautious now, perhaps even a little intimidated, unsure of how to approach the woman who had just silently commanded respect. As the wheels touched down and the plane taxied to the private terminal, Angela felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. She wasn't concerned about what had happened back in the cabin or the drama that had unfolded. That was in the past, and what mattered now was what she would do moving forward. She wasn't a woman who thrived on conflict, but she knew that sometimes the best way to make an impact was to stand firm in your beliefs and show others what respect really meant. The airplane rolled smoothly to a stop, and as the passengers gathered their things and prepared to disembark, Angela stayed seated, her posture relaxed but proud. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, some curious, some still in shock from what had occurred. As she slowly gathered her bag and stood up, Angela walked down the aisle, her heels clicking against the floor in a steady rhythm. She didn't need to say anything. Her presence alone was enough to convey the lesson she wanted everyone to learn. She didn't need to fight to be heard or prove her worth to anyone. What had happened was now a part of her story, but it didn't define her. As she approached the door of the jet, a man in a navy suit, an unfamiliar figure, who stood with an air of authority, caught her eye. He was waiting for her, standing near the door, and Angela could see the unease in his posture. He wasn't a pilot or a flight attendant. No, he was corporate, Danielle's corporate. He had arrived to handle the aftermath of what had transpired. Melinda spotted him immediately, her face draining of color as she stood awkwardly by the door, still trying to recover from the emotional turmoil of the past hour. She clutched her apron with trembling hands, her breath shallow, and Angela could sense the fear in her. Melinda knew what was coming. As Angela walked toward her, she couldn't help but notice the woman's posture. Small, almost childlike now, her previous defiance and arrogance gone, replaced with an obvious sense of dread. Angela didn't stop. She didn't need to berate her or make her feel worse. Melinda had already learned the lesson. It was in the way her shoulders sagged, in the way she looked to the corporate man for some kind of salvation. Angela had already made her point clear. When she reached the door, she turned to face Melinda one last time. "People will forget what you said," Angela began, her voice calm and almost tender, but filled with a quiet authority. "They'll forget what you did, but they won't forget how you made them feel." The words were simple, yet powerful, and they hung in the air, thick with meaning. Melinda looked up at her, eyes glassy, lips quivering, but she said nothing. She couldn't. Angela had already won. She had shown Melinda, and everyone else who had been watching, that true power didn't need to be announced or flaunted. It didn't need to be proven. It was in the way you held yourself, in the strength to remain calm when everyone else was falling apart. Angela could see the wheels turning in Melinda's mind, the understanding finally dawning on her. Melinda, for all her bravado, hadn't realized the power dynamics she had underestimated. Angela was more than just the woman sitting in the first-class seat of her jet. She was a force to be reckoned with, not because of her wealth or her title, but because of the quiet strength she carried with her. "You made me feel invisible," Angela continued, her voice low but resolute. "Like I didn't belong in a space I built with my own hands. Like I had to prove my worth just to sit down." The words were like a mirror, reflecting the deep-seated biases that Melinda had so carelessly projected onto her. And Angela didn't need to say more. She had made her point. Turning toward the corporate man, who had remained silent through it all, Angela simply nodded. "This will cost you far more than your job," she said softly, letting the words settle between them before turning to leave. As she stepped off the plane and into the bright Texas sun, Angela knew that this moment, this quiet act of standing her ground, had been a lesson in power, respect, and dignity. It wasn't about revenge. It was about showing others that their assumptions didn't define her. And in the end, it was that message, the one she had delivered without raising her voice, that would be remembered.